longer than 100 years, very advanced breakthroughs in very high voltage electromagnetic systems that result in pulling energy out of the fabric of space-time around us. And you may call this a sort of trans-dimensional type of energy generation system, and it really is the secret behind how so-called UFOs fly, move, levitate, appear in one place, disappear, and reappear in another. And it isn't as if this is new to people in the classified scientific community. And we have worked with many, many people over the years who have actually done work in this area, who've worked for various three-letter agencies, as well as the Department of Defense and corporations. And much of the work has been done through corporations under contract to the Department of Defense and CIA and other agencies. But over the years, what we've discovered is that there's a cache of information, and some of this is on the OrionProject.org website. It's all one word, the Orion Project. And there's an enormous amount of historical information there for people to click through and read. But what we really want to focus on today is sort of pulling back the veil of what the secrecy has really been about from the UFO issue. For many people, this is the hardest thing to understand. So that's what we want to focus on and kind of give you an overview of over the next hour or so. So I'd like to thank Dr. Loader for joining us. Hello, Ted.
You're welcome, and good to be here again.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that you can join me. And why don't you make some comments about what you discovered in your research from, like the early days, I mean, going back to the time of, Faraday and Nikola Tesla and folks like that.
Well, the whole energy issue does go back to the 1800s.
Right.
Faraday and others working with him really kind of figured out how things work. It's quite an amazing tribute to those men who are absolute geniuses, that they did figure out how electromagnetism, or at least the observable electromagnetism worked, not how it works at the atomic or nuclear level. I still don't think anybody really understands that, or we'd be further along. But they did work this out in the mid 1800s. It's quite amazing. And by the late 1800s, 1890, we have Nikola Tesla, who was really one of the true geniuses of the late early 1900s, right up to the 1940s. Nikola Tesla took their knowledge and really figured out how to, first of all, he invented the concept of alternating current, which is what runs most of the electricity in the world today. Thomas Edison was his competitor who was trying to use direct current, which doesn't have the long-distance power to deliver. But Nikola Tesla worked that out. He worked out how to generate it. He designed and did a lot of work on Niagara Falls power plants back in the late 1800s, 1890s or so. So with that in mind, he was already way ahead of people. And by the into the very early 1900s, 1902 or 3, some of the what should we call them, laws of electronics or whatever else, laws of electricity, were rewritten. The equations that describe these things that Faraday had worked out with his colleagues, those equations were in a certain mathematical format, and they were rewritten in a simpler mathematic format and excluding the terms that described how to get zero-point energy.
Correct. This is what Dr. Tom Bearden and others have discovered. The equations were actually, in a sense, dumbed down and simplified to take out really where the magic and really where the big breakthrough was happening, and that was the explanation of that there was this, there are archaic terms like the ether and or the vacuum of space and what have you, but that where these explained that under certain conditions and done properly, you can pull energy out of the fabric of space, the so-called zero-point energy field, the energy field from which all subatomic particles and all matter is fluxing in and out, and run your house or car. And this, for many people, I think in the mainstream scientific world, they would think this would be an urban myth, but it is not. It was only figured out mathematically, but it was figured out experimentally, and there are very credible reports that there were people who had these kind of so-called free energy machines, which is although it's a misnomer because there's no free energy. There's a complete conservation of energy in the universe, but it's just that there's a huge part of the energy of the universe that they're just now beginning to describe, where there is a dark energy or dark matter and all this sort of thing, and that they had found a way to tap into this energy field and without breaking the atom and creating lots of radiation, that would result in the ability for a generator or motor to run itself and also run your house and what have you without burning oil and gas and coal. But the key thing for folks to understand here, and if there's some red flags and red lights going off in your head about now, it should, the folks of that, or the sort of what they call the Gilded Age of the big industrialists and the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan and all these kinds of folks, they were no more interested in giving people free energy than the masters of the universe are interested in doing that today. And so what you have is a 100-year history of suppression and corruption that has resulted in us still being addicted to coal and gas and oil and nuclear power more than we were 50 or 100 years ago. And that's the key thing that people need to understand.
That's so true. The really actually depressing part of this issue is that when those equations were rewritten, Nikola Tesla had already figured out some of this, but those equations are what have driven electrical engineering and energy engineering since the early 1900s, or before 1910. And so there's been 4 generations of electrical engineers since that time who believe that the only equations are the ones that were dumbed down. And they don't go back and look at the earlier ones because they're in mathematical form that is hard to do. The interesting thing is by the 1930s, Paul Dirac and others.
Yeah, for those who want to know, Dirac, D-I-R-E-C, I believe is the spelling.
A-C. D-I-R-A-C.
D-I-R-A-C. And yeah, he came up with something called the Dirac C.
Exactly. And he actually figured out and wrote in his papers how one could extract energy from this zero-point energy field that Dr. Greer just mentioned. And he described basically by essentially pulsing the field and then having allows the energy to flow into whatever device you're using. He described how to do this mathematically, theoretically, and practically. So since that time period, Tesla had already done it experimentally, but since that time period, it was also described theoretically how to do this. So that's 80 years from now. And along that line, is this news to you? It shouldn't be. And just to add a little note, and I'll turn this back over to Dr. Greer, is that I received an email just yesterday from somebody describing the 10 biggest corporate media cover-ups. The 10 biggest corporate media cover-up. And the second one in their list is free energy technology pioneered by Nikola Tesla more than 100 years ago has been suppressed to maintain giant corporate interests. So this is, being distributed to all kinds of people. And the same robber barons who suppressed free energy 100 years ago, involved in the takeover of public treasury, it goes on and on. So that was one of the issues. So out of the top 10 issues, the next one, the other one that they mentioned of interest is increasing UFO activity is openly reported in nations worldwide, but a blackout in the U.S. corporate media continues. Anyway, I'll turn this back to... Yeah,
that's a very interesting summary, and it's quite accurate. And in fact, what we discovered in our research on this is that we have a very senior scientist in the Department of Defense. In fact, it's the largest laboratory in the Department of Defense, and this is one of the top 2 or 3 scientists there. And he told us that he got into the quote-unquote vault that has a lot of the unredacted documents dealing with UFOs and these sort of energy and propulsion issues. And he said that you could trace back to, particularly on the UFO issue where you're dealing with energy and propulsion, that things that had been in aerospace journals in the 40s and early 50s, everything was redacted and went black and sanitized around 1954, when we had sort of figured out how to effectively control for gravity and control for mass cancellation, if you want to look at it that way, so that things could float using not only these new energy aspects, but by configuring them in certain ways, you could cancel the mass of an object so it would levitate or lift. And anyone who's seen a UFO fly or move or seen video of it, you can tell that they're moving in a non-aerodynamic way, meaning that they're not subject to the regular G-forces that a jet aircraft or an airplane or anything else or what have you would be subjected to. They are actually moving in a way as if they are in a vacuum, can make right-hand turns going 20,000 miles an hour, which is impossible aerodynamically. And it's because, and it was figured out in our country by then, but you actually can go back to the time of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler and discover, in fact, we were recently sent an authentic photograph of one of these anti-gravity vehicles that Germany had that was in the 1940s. And interestingly, I mean, Ted, you might want to share with people this conversation you had with the son of a very senior Luftwaffe figure who was a genius, a mathematics genius, and what have you.
That is correct. Well, recently, I've spent some time chatting with a friend of mine. He's become a friend now, and his father was in the German Luftwaffe. Knew Hitler, was a pilot, Luftwaffe or Air Force, a German Air Force pilot, and a crack ace pilot for the German Luftwaffe. He was not doing it willingly. In fact, the story I keep getting from him and others is that many of the people in the military did their military duty for Germany not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to, and either that or their families were threatened. It was very anyway. What he described to his son, who's now in his 60s and getting on, his father subsequently died. What he described to his son was actually seeing, or being shown a demonstration of shall we call it a UFO craft. It wasn't unidentified. They knew what it was, but it was a German Nazi anti-gravity craft.
Yeah.
That literally, he said, just hovered over the father telling the son now, telling me, he said the father described it as hovering over the ground and then just shooting straight up into space out of sight in a matter of seconds. And the son told me that his father understood a lot of the mathematics, but when the war was over, basically did not want to speak about it, came to the United States, and just started a new life here. Although periodically former Nazi people associated with it would show up at his house in the United States asking him to be involved in some things, to which he continually refused. He was done and wanted out of it. But we've all heard stories of the Germans having developed some of this anti-gravity technology, but I think what happened, according to him, is basically the war ended before they could sort of really mount a major effort in that area, or probably the war would have gone in a different direction.
Right, and that was the secret weapon they were working on as we were working on the Manhattan Project with the first atomic bomb, of course, which we subsequently dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and certainly would have dropped on Germany had the war not come to a closure. But what's interesting is that even in the mainstream literature, there's a book called Operation Paperclip, and it describes the old OSS, which became the CIA, that when they found scientists like this gentleman you're referring to, his father, but also people like Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, they would stick a paperclip on their file so they didn't go to the Nuremberg trials, but would be brought into the U.S. Intelligence community and aerospace community, and they actually came into our governments operations and subsequently have taken over. So this is where Jim Marrs and I have talked about, who wrote the book called The Fourth Reich, where there's a clandestine sort of Fourth Reichian program, but they've just been much more sophisticated at keeping it secret and not being as clumsy as Adolf Hitler was. But the consequences are the same in the sense that we have 7 billion people who are now virtual slaves economically to a macroeconomic system driven by a relatively small handful of corporations and individuals who understand this information and are ruthlessly keeping it secret. And one of the things I wanted to point out, going back to Tesla, we have a photograph, and it's up at the OrionProject.org site, of Nikola Tesla with a guy named Stubblefield, where he had developed this Earth battery, which if you have the correct saline composition of the soil, you can pull energy out of the electromagnetic potential between the Earth and, let's say, an antenna that's up a few meters and generate electricity, a voltage potential, and run things. And that this was actually, in 1908, taken and demonstrated to people in Congress. And there's a photograph of Nikola Tesla with this Stubblefield, who was a sort of a self-taught guy, a farmer. And so there have been all kinds of new energy breakthroughs, which is why we've been looking for support to open a lab that would not be associated with large corporations or the government, so that we could bring this information out. And the key thing people have to understand is that there's nothing new under the sun, at least for the last 100 years. Even if you look at the work of the Kolosky-Frost experiment in the 1920s, the work of T. Townsend Brown using high voltage systems that resulted in things that would levitate, and T. Townsend Brown eventually began to do some things with the Air Force and other classified projects.
And the Office of Naval Research. Yep.
Yes, and with the Office of Naval Research, ONR. What you find is that this is a whole area of secret technologies that has been around and been studied from the 1800s forward. And that's why when you do a search on this issue, you discover that there are still classified documents from the late 1800s and early 1900s that have never been declassified. And the reason for that is that a lot of this was figured out. And so one of the things that I try to explain to people is that, all the global warming, all the poverty in the world, the destruction of the atmosphere, the poisoning of the oceans, the starvation that's going on globally, that's a result of our macroeconomic system that's a zero-sum game of have and have-nots, the huge amount of damage going on to people's health because of all this pollution, on and on and on. This is all a consequence of the avarice, the greed, and the corruption in power that has existed not for 10 or 20 years or, tracing it back to one party or one. This has gone on for over 100 years. And the common denominator in it all is the accumulation of enormous amounts of power and control in the hands of a relatively few. And this is, of course, not only anti-democratic, but it's at the point now where it's really a risk to the future of humanity and the destruction of the Earth's biosphere, where we have hundreds of species of plants and animals and what have you becoming extinct. Large parts of the oceans are dying. Whether you believe in global warming or not, we certainly have a lot of air pollution and other problems, and most importantly, the geopolitical catastrophe that we're facing because we have ourselves encamped in the Middle East. And let's face it, we're encamped in the Middle East not because we're so concerned about instituting Jeffersonian democracy in that area. It's because of Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia are sitting on the largest oil fields in the world. And frankly, it's about oil, which we don't need. And the only thing we need oil for is for plastics and things like that, and that would be a tiny rounding percentage of the amount of oil that we use for jet fuel and cars and generators and things. The other thing that people have to think about is that I was just reading an article in a scientific journal about how coal use is going up exponentially, and that India and China are having to run almost all of their new electric generation capabilities off the dirtiest coal-fired power plants on Earth, and that this is accelerating, not decelerating. So as bad as people see it here in the United States, where we have a lot of pollution from coal-fired power plants and arsenic and mercury poisoning and things of this sort, it's much, much, much worse in developing countries. Then they simply don't have the other sources to do this with, to generate the amount of power they need for their industrial base and what have you. Now, and that can all become very depressing to think about for too long. And what I tell people is, well, yes, that's the problem. Let's focus on the solution. And the solution, thankfully, is here, but it's been suppressed and hidden. So how do you do that? And this is where the whole concept of disclosureproject.org and the orionproject.org of trying to pull this information together and find the public support, private support, to put together the means to not only disclose the information, but to take it to the next step and start bringing out these technologies. But that is going to be to do that is very, very difficult because you're facing enormous suppressive efforts. I have a document, just as another parenthetical, about Nikola Tesla, who I believe was the great genius of the 20th century, much more so than Albert Einstein, that he was someone who, when he died under what some people feel were mysterious circumstances, the FBI went in and confiscated all of his secret papers. And he had become quite an eccentric because he had been so embattled with losing this sort of battle with big business and Westinghouse and GE, which Thomas and Edison started, and all of this. But what's interesting, the reason we know this is true is that I got a document from the government. It's an official document that's from the Department of Defense of the United States demanding to the FBI that they turn over the Nikola Tesla papers to them, but the FBI didn't want to. So you have, even within the agencies of the United States, this effort to sort of sit on and hoard this information, and but from one dysfunctional agency to another. And of course, as everyone knows, there's nothing more corrupt and dysfunctional than the United States government. But
well, I would add a comment in there, Steve, if I may. If we go back to the Disclosure Project book, the Disclosure Project that we did 10 years ago, a little over 10 years, 11 years ago, there was a witness in the Disclosure Project, which we named AH, because at that time he was still an active employee of Boeing Aerospace.
Right.
Well, the interesting thing, and this goes right along with what you're saying, the interesting thing is that in his interview, he talked about meeting with General Curtis LeMay,
right,
Four-Star General, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and one whom history now shows was intimately involved in the whole UFO set of issues as his role in the Air Force.
Right.
Now, he also said that he interviewed and discussed things with Curtis LeMay, who said, yes, about 35% of the sightings of UFOs could not be identified, typically because they were so damn fast we couldn't catch them, to quote LeMay. And he also said the Roswell crash occurred along with that. But later on he noted that the CIA basically took everything away, obviously not everything, but a vast amount of material and information away from the Air Force.
Right.
So the CIA, this is back in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s, when it was first formed, took the stuff from the Air Force, and he was asked, well, did the FBI get some of it? And his comment was, again, interagency squabbling here, and his comment was, no, it's all wrapped up with the CIA, and they took it away from him, and he was angry, said AH. So what we have here is that the Air Force was initially involved in it, I think the Roswell crash and the air base in New Mexico where all that happened, in Roswell, and the Air Force, and then we move on to the CIA taking it from the Air Force. Meanwhile, the FBI is in there trying to get some of it, but later on, as you can see, same time period, they're getting as many of the papers from Nikola Tesla. So these different agencies have different pieces of the pie, if you will, which is, of course, part of the reason why the thing has been so suppressed for so long. They squabble among themselves.
Well, but you know, within all that structure, there are folks who move amongst the agencies who actually represent their own entity, and this gets into the concept of a parallel or secret government within the government. What Senator Inouye of Hawaii during the Iran-Contra hearings, and you can see this at disclosureproject.org and in our video, where the senator says that there exists a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism that's above the law and free from the law itself. And it simply moves not just within the United States but transnationally, and it is the world's largest corrupt influence, and it uses different agencies and to abuse people and abuse systems and to suppress this sort of thing. And it's very shadowy. It's very, very well thought through. It's not that they're stupid at all, but it's enormously corrupt. It is the largest corrupt enterprise on earth, and would make the drug cartels in Mexico or any other corrupt enterprise look like nothing. And, of course, anyone who starts getting close to any of these secrets hits that buzzsaw. I certainly have, and so have other people. And if you read the accounts of people, even if you if you go to disclosureproject.org, you'll see there's a book and also DVDs that are there. And in the book, there's an extensive interview with Colonel Brown, who had actually been part of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base facility, had been part of the documentation and filming and chasing of these ET craft back in the post-World War II period. And this colonel told me that he had discovered a way of using very high voltage sort of electrostatic systems to put into a humidified air system so that your intake on your engine could get 20 to 40% more fuel economy. And now this is a retired colonel with the Air Force, started getting bomb threats, had his laboratory at his home sabotaged, had his prototypes stolen. Now, this is all this guy is a person of impeccable credentials, and this is one of dozens of people like this that Dr. Loader and I have talked with and met with over the years where this has happened. And it's not just in the United States. It's happened in Japan. It's happened to people who come up with these things in Europe or in Brazil and what have you. So there is this corporate beast, I call it Murder Incorporated, that is very well integrated and determined to keep this stuff secret, which is why the book I wrote about my own journey through this, that many of you have read, and you can get it at disclosureproject.org, is called Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge. Because this is the hidden truth and the forbidden knowledge they don't want the public to know. And the corporate media lackeys will not report on it. But thank God now we have the Internet. And but it's very important for people to understand this. And it's another point of confirmation. What Dr. Loader was just talking about, I just spoke last week with this and he has now identified a couple of other very important new top-secret witnesses for Disclosure Project. And I'm announcing here today we have come to an agreement with an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker to make a film that will be the definitive blow the lid off this thing sky high that we plan to have come out in the next year. And we are going to do this through the crowdfunding sort of efforts. And so stay tuned. Those of you who want to be a part of this, let us know. And we're going to put the very best video, photographic, audio tape, interviews with top secret people, new people since Disclosure Project released materials a decade ago, and all the information that we've collected on the energy and propulsion aspect and all the information we have on making contact with ETs. This is all going to be in this really historic film that's going to be the most important groundbreaking project in the history of this subject, and we're planning to do it this year. And we have found a fantastic production team headed up by a man who won an Emmy for doing a documentary. And this is going to be announced in the next few weeks publicly. So I just wanted people to have a heads up. If you want to get information about this, please contact disclosureproject.org, and there's a way that you can click a button there and you can get on our mailing list for free where we notify you of all the developments about this, and you can sign up there or at cseti.org, and also you can follow us. We're going to have an increasing number of things that we're going to release on Facebook and YouTube in the coming months. So we're in the process of reorganizing what we're doing for this next huge thrust into disclosure. And this filmmaker has agreed that the proceeds of this film, which if it does well could be very significant, that he and I have agreed that the proceeds of this will go into building the laboratory and bringing out these earth-saving technologies, and that is the purpose of what we're going to do. So we're going to view every listener of the World Fusion Network as a co-producer and distributor of this information, and if we can do this successfully, we should be able to have the means to basically do this as a movement, as a citizens movement, independent of the corporations and the big government corruption. So you're not going to solve that problem by stirring around the darkness and describing it. You're going to solve it by just simply, the darkness goes away when you strike the first match, and here's how we're going to do that. Now, that also means that we're going to certainly face more harassment, more death threats. In the last year, I have received multiple incredible death threats. I have received unbelievable harassment from federal agencies and federal bureaucrats that who no doubt are somehow have marching orders being taken from these corrupt interests. The point is we're going to need your help and support, and to do that, you're going to need to stay in touch with us and communicate with us. So sign up on that list if you can and have a heads up on this. But the other thing I wanted to point out about what you just shared about Curtis LeMay, now many people who may have read this in Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, but some years ago I met with a man who, those of you who are old enough to remember, ran for President of the United States in 1964. His name was Senator Barry Goldwater. And Senator Goldwater was the senior senator from Arizona that he had the seat that now Senator John McCain holds. And Senator Goldwater and I met at his home back in the 1990s to discuss this problem. And Senator Goldwater had a long-standing interest in UFOs. He was a general in the Air Force Reserves, and he was very, very close friends with current General Curtis LeMay. And that when Senator Goldwater and I were discussing this matter, I asked Senator Goldwater, what kind of discussions he had with General Curtis LeMay, who, by the way, has also recently come out that there were some missing audio tapes the day that John F. Kennedy was killed, and that General LeMay was somehow on a plane, and these audio tapes were missing. There's a whole shadowy issue here, but I don't want to get too far into the weeds. But let me tell you, I told Oliver Stone's assistant when he did the movie JFK that he almost got it right. That he missed the punchline, and that the secrecy was driven about the stuff we're talking about today, not Cuba. The point being that when I asked Senator Goldwater about this, I said, Barry, well, what did Curtis LeMay say to you? He said, well, he acknowledged this was real. And Barry had heard from Senator Goldwater had heard from other pilots and whatnot, because he was in the Air Force. And as a general, he's a senior senator. I mean, he'd been on the Armed Services Committees and all these things in the U.S. Congress. But Senator Goldwater told me he personally had never been briefed in any official capacity on this, even though he knew things were going on. Now think about that for a moment. This is the man who is the Republican presidential nominee, the arch conservative of his era, a general in the Air Force Reserve, and close personal friends with the General Curtis LeMay, who absolutely in the early days was involved with this, but in his official capacity in the U.S. government was never told anything, and he was in dismay as I talked to him about this. So I said, well, what did you ask of General LeMay, Curtis LeMay? He says, I asked him as a friend to get me into the quote-unquote blue room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which back in the 40s and early 50s is where a lot of the material from, for example, the Roswell crash and what have you had been sent to be studied by the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force, FTD. which got renamed the Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Center and the National Air Intelligence Center. It's gone through a whole bunch of different name changes using alphabet soup to hide it, basically. And I said, well, what did General LeMay say to you when you said you wanted to go there? I said, and Senator Goldwater looked me straight in the eye, and I have a witness for this. And he said, Dr. Greer, he looked at me and he said, God damn it, Barry, I can't even get into that area anymore. And if you ever ask me about this again, I will personally see that you are court-martialed out of the Air Force as a general. This is his friend, General LeMay, talking to a sitting U.S. senator who was in the running to be the president of the United States. Now, that is how secret this stuff is. Now, interestingly, I asked Senator Goldwater, I said, well, was he serious? And he looked at me, he says, he was serious as a heart attack. And I never asked General LeMay about this again for as long as I lived. Now, this is a 100% true story, and these meetings I had with Senator Goldwater have now been confirmed by the release from the Goldwater Library in the last month, back in March, about these meetings that I had with him. Now, here's the pièce de résistance, is that after this discussion, he started asking me, he says, well, who have you been briefing on this? And I said, well, you know, I briefed President Clinton's team and his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, and I've met with the head of the head investigator for the Senate Appropriations Committee. I've met with, and I went on and on. And he says, well, what are they? I said, well, they were in the same boat you were in, Senator. This kind of secret collegium of folks running this didn't tell them a thing. And that even when the president made inquiries, they wouldn't tell him anything. And when the CIA director made inquiries, they wouldn't tell him anything because it is so secret. And so he looked at me. He says, well, who is involved in this secrecy? So I started naming some people that I had learned from very reliable sources were members of this so-called Majestic Committee. It used to be called back in the Truman and Eisenhower era. And one of them was Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. And Admiral Inman had been head of the National Security Agency, but before then had been deputy director of the CIA, but at that time had gone on to the board of directors of Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, which is a huge government contractor that has dealt with some of this stuff. And he says, so when I started naming different names, he didn't know some of them, but when I landed on Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, he says, oh, I know Bobby Ray. I've known him for years. And I said, well, Senator Goldwater, would you pick up the phone and give him a call and see if we can meet to see if we can get some cooperation on making a change and disclosing this information, bringing this science and technology out so we can get out of Mideast oil and we can make a civilization here that works and that is free. And Senator Goldwater was very enthusiastic about doing this, so he did it. And let me tell you, after that, Senator Goldwater contacted me, and he says, I can't make any more phone calls like that. And then his daughter, Joanne Goldwater, Goldwater Foods of Arizona, and I spoke on the phone, and he says, she just says, I don't know what Bobby Ray Inman said to Daddy, meaning her father, Senator Goldwater, but he cannot make another phone call like that. It put the fear of God in him. So welcome to my life, but this is the kind of stuff that I deal with on a weekly basis. But unfortunately, what you have here is a level of secrecy and corruption that transcends what you would even think of as a normal black ops within the military intelligence world. And it is really very erosive because they have so much accumulated wealth and power that there's no member of the Congress and no president that's willing to stand up to them. And so what you have now, Jack Kennedy tried to, and it cost him his life. That I know for a fact. So what you have as a situation is how do you get out of this kind of cesspool of secrecy? That's sort of this cul-de-sac just going around in a circle here for 100 years. You've got to have the populace educated. You've got to have the people get behind an effort. And that's why we need people to spread the word on this. Share the links to this World Puja show and let people see what's at the OrionProject.org, DisclosureProject.org, and get ready for every single person listening to be a distributor of this film, because this thing's going to go viral. Our goal is to have between 1 and 2 billion people see this film after it comes out, where we can unleash a public movement for not only disclosure, but for us, the people, building up these technologies. Because what Dr. Loader and I have accumulated over the years is a vast archive of secret patents, designs, technical information, personnel who could work on these systems, but they can't do it on their own, scattered around the world. We've got to have a facility. We've got to have security. We've got to have some nominal funding. And I don't mean the funding that Facebook has, billions, but some seed funding. And we've never been able to get that because the wealthy people are intimidated, the masses haven't responded, and the government, when we've made applications through the ARPA-E program that Obama started with Stephen Chu, they basically threw our request for funding back in our face and said, no thanks. So we're basically in a situation where we, the people, have to do this. And if we, the people, don't, well, dig a hole and climb in it, because things are going to get worse before they get better. So I think that we have to make a choice as a people in our society. Are we going to go forward and pull our resources together to do this? Now, you know, I've given up my medical career and the income as a medical doctor. Dr. Bravo has as well. Dr. Loader has given up a lot of resources, took time off from his university position. But, you know, we're just a few people. We're going to have, and we're not wealthy people, so we're going to have to figure out how to do this in a way that isn't sort of reliant on corrupt influences funding it. And the best way to do it, we feel, is through the public. And so through this sort of crowdfunding effort and making this film, having it go viral, and generating sort of a zeitgeist of information, sort of a momentum that can go out through the public that can support this, we feel that this is the best approach that we've come up to date. And now that we have found an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker to do this with us, we feel that we'll be able to create something that will have enormous appeal around the world, because it's not only going to go through all the information, the best of the best we have in disclosure, which is substantial, but the best that we have on all this new energy and propulsion information, and then the crescendo is all the information about the science of consciousness, transdimensional technologies, contact. And so it leaves people with this vision of the future where we have entered into a new world with free energy, anti-gravity technologies, interplanetary travel, universal peace, and the war machine has been silenced and has been shut off. So this is what we have to do. It is a massive revolution. I don't use that word kindly usually, but a revolution in the sense of the ones that happened in Eastern Europe that were nonviolent. This is a revolution and an evolution of human society that has been forestalled for 100 years. But we don't have another 100 years to fritter away. So we need to be able to do this together as a people. And I think if all of us join our resources and pull together on this, we can do it. And it's a really exciting development that's been happening here in the last couple of months with Disclosure Project and CSETI.
Yeah, let me pop in with that, because it is very exciting. I think that's the key word. The interesting thing is we probably could not have done this a few years ago. First of all, we needed a type of producer who had the skills and desire to really work with us. Second of all, the CSETI team has not been sitting on our laurels over the past 10 years, although I have people ask me all the time, well, are you guys doing anything? Well, we're doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, talking to people, learning what's going on, talking to more witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. So as Dr. Greer mentioned, there's a number of new witnesses coupled with the fact that we had over 100 hours of videotape interviews and only used in the Disclosure Project 4 hours of that interview. So there's still a gold mine of information, Plus, we have a number of new witnesses who have seen what we've talked about with the energy information and have come forth in the energy sector. So there's a whole new group of information. And the third thing, or fourth thing, wherever I'm at here, of information is that the world, the media, not the mainstream media, but the alternative media and the Internet, has really been pushing the concept of zero-point energy, that there are some alternatives available that need to be done and used. So there's a groundswell going on that essentially what we plan to do is hop on top of that wave of the groundswell with some definitive information coupled with what the groundswell is doing. More and more people are aware of this, but they don't know quite what it's about or what to do with it or how it can be done. What we plan to do is provide that vision of what can be done and how it should be done.
Yes, and see, this film can be the grain of sand that makes the pearl of a whole new world. Because if the film can be successful and everyone makes this thing go viral, where hundreds of millions or billions of people see it, what can happen is that then that can generate the funding that's needed through sort of crowdfunding efforts to do this. Because I'm very skeptical. I mean, first of all, we have tried through the Orion Project to raise a few $1,000s that we provided to various people working out of their basements or, their garage. That isn't going to happen. The people who actually have the ability to do that we provided some funding to, the main one, less than 2 years ago, got visited by a former CIA director who threatened his life and that of his family if he didn't betray us and stop working. And this is a guy who gets his paycheck from a U.S. government contractor, works in an underground SCIF, Secure Communication Intelligence Facility, who took funding from the Orion Project to do this, but then was basically warned off. So here's the problem. This isn't going to happen, I hate to say this, on the cheap, meaning with a few $1,000s. We're going to have to raise, $6, $8, $10 million, somewhere in that range, to open a proper R&D facility. And believe me, in research and development terms, $6 million is what we spent here in my little rural county in Virginia to build a dog shelter. That was just the construction cost for the dog pound. So, but in a 2-year period, if we had that level of funding, we could do this. But getting that funding has been very, very difficult from conventional sources. This is why we're going to have to take it to the people, but in a much bigger way than we have in the past. Now, one of the good things to point out is that, and it's also very exciting, Disclosure Project, over the last 10 years, when we launched that, the Internet was nowhere near as developed as it was. Remember in 2001 when the National Press Club event happened, that was the most watched event in the history of the Internet at that time. In history, period.
Correct.
Okay, now, but at that time, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have YouTube, you didn't have Twitter, and the capacity of the Internet was such that after 500,000 people or so tried to get on live to see this thing at the National Press Club, they couldn't handle it. I mean, the company that was hosting this for the National Press Club pulled me in a couple weeks later and said, we have never seen such demand. And, in fact, we had to use up every T1 line, which is what they were using back then, to be able to even carry any of this capacity. So now, of course, the Internet, all the social media sites, YouTube, and what have you is such that we can come out with this film, bypass the big studios and the big, the corporate media world, and bring this stuff out to billions of people. And that's what we have to do. And this is the strategy we're going to use, because having done a lot of interfacing personally with large studios, with Fox Studios, with large producers and directors. I personally met with the executive producer for a lot of the ABC News programming, with the person who's the chief guy at 60 Minutes. All those people, even though you give them 35 hours of top secret testimony and thousands of pages of documents that prove all this on a silver platter, invariably they get back to me and they say, Dr. Greer, corporate won't let us run this story. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory to the debunkers out there. This is fact. These are meetings I have had for a decade, and over over and over again, you hit this brick wall when you're dealing with the large, corrupt corporate media, and that includes the Hollywood studios. So what we've decided to do is do an independent film with a really good filmmaker and put the best of all this information together and release it to the world. And that's what we're going to do, and we're going to rely on all of you listening to fund the project and to distribute it and to basically take ownership of it. And that's what we're going to be announcing in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and they will be publicly known. So it's very, very exciting because we you know, having done this now for 22 years and gone through every nightmare scenario you can imagine, what I've concluded is that the president isn't going to touch this with a 10-foot pole because he doesn't want to end up like Jack Kennedy. And I was told that by a close friend of Bill Clinton's. The congressmen, even the most supportive ones that we've met with and discussed this with, like Congressman Dennis Kucinich and others, they can't make any headway on this. The people who do the FOIA requests, well, you make a request for a Freedom of Information Act, but these things are running on in a parallel secret government operation that the FOIA officers don't have access to. So they can't release what they don't have any access to. And then you go to people who are in the corporate world, and those folks, if they know what side their bread is being buttered on, or they're afraid. I mean, like one big industrialist who, well, he used to, he provided some significant support for Disclosure Project, but when we asked him to help with this energy effort, he looked at me, he says, nope, I've got children and grandchildren, and I don't want to be killed. And this is a person who had an income of $750 million a year. So the amount of funds we would need would be a rounding error. Let's just say this guy has 5 private jets. I've been in his home. He lives on 1,500 acres out near Hot Springs. And this is someone who, let me tell you, I mean, what we would need to do this project would be, they wouldn't even notice it. He blows more money than that out of his 5 private corporate jets that they own. So the point I'm making is, I'm convinced, having knocked on every door and tried every approach for 22 years, that ultimately the way we started is the way this is going to happen, and that is going to be we the people. And, you know, it's interesting because 10 years ago when we were doing Disclosure Project, we were having a group meeting here at my farm, which is near Thomas Jefferson's house, Monticello, out here in near the University of Virginia. And I had the most amazing thought that was sent into my mind as we were making these big posters and storyboarding how we were going to launch this whole disclosure movement worldwide. And I swear, although this is certainly very subjective, but it was remote viewed, I saw that it was Thomas Jefferson's spirit, and he said, the next American Revolution. It was just chilling. And I went, well, yeah. Because the original concept of democracy and freedom and the people has been utterly corrupted by large financial and corporate interests. Interestingly, I found something that Thomas Jefferson had written around the time the United States was founded, warning of the unchecked power of these kind of corporations subverting democracy. It isn't to say that all corporations are bad or evil, but it is to say that there is a proclivity towards corruption. I mean, how else can you explain General Electric having a $15 billion profit and paying no taxes, where someone like me pays 50% in taxes? I mean, this can only be because, as Fareed Zakaria, CNN said a couple weeks ago, the IRS and the federal government has been utterly corrupted by these interests. And in other countries, people just carry a bag of cash under a bridge and meet with an official. Here, you have large corporations that basically write the tax code so that the very wealthy pay nothing, zero. And the rest of the people are hit full bore. And what you find also is the same thing with the contracting world for the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, where there's all kinds of just flat-out thievery. You know, Rumsfeld himself, the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, the day before 9/11, said there's over $2 trillion missing out of the Department of Defense. Where'd it go? It went into these things. And unfortunately, that money is gone. But the knowledge that we're accumulating is real, and so we have to say, all right, the past is the past. Let's go forward and begin a new civilization that is just, that is free, that is abundant, and that is peaceful, and that can go into space together in universal peace. That's the vision that we want to bring to the public, because, you know, there's no point in stirring around the darkness of the past. That's water under the bridge, as fetid as it may be. But I think that this is what we want to do, and the capacity for a lot of what we want to do now didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, and it exists today. So we're very excited about that, and I hope all of you listening will share this show with other folks and say, look, this needs to really get the support of the people we need, and you know, as soon as we have everything up and ready to go, we're going to notify our list, so sign up at disclosureproject.org, and we'll notify you.
Any changes are coming.
The other thing I just want to mention, we are getting ready. A lot of you have heard about our expeditions in Colorado. We're going to be going to Crestone, Colorado, which is up in the San Luis Valley in June from the 17th to the 14th. And then we're going to be up on Mount Shasta with making contact with the ETs August 11th to the 18th. So those of you who want to do that, you can find out more about that at cseti.org. And we're going to be going there and teaching people how to do the remote viewing and the contact protocols. And last year when we were in Colorado, we had some of the most amazing contact, and it's actually on some private land that I own out in the San Luis Valley. And you look up at the Sangre de Cristo Mountains right at the Tibetan stupa that the Dalai Lama asked Ambassador Jim George